you dudes and dudettes. I'm Marc Daniel Nelson with Make Mine Music. Today I want to do my top 10 recording books, my top favorite recording books, all the way back to when I was a teenager. I started collecting recording books, any kind of knowledge I could get regarding it, if it was a biography or almost like a handbook of how-tos. I was always collecting as many books as you could see over here. I have a shelf full of Beatles books and recording books. On the table here, I have my top 10 favorite books. So today I'm going to talk about the top 10 favorite books and one tip from each book. It could either be kind of trade secrets or biography stories of the engineer producer that was telling it. Now, all these 10 books have their own kind of unique reasoning behind why I think they're great. Now, it doesn't mean that the books that I'm not adding to this list aren't great, because I know there's a ton out there. And in fact, I have about 4 or 5 other ones that I didn't include. It just goes to show about specific things I learned in each book and why I felt that these were the best. So let's dive right in and go to number 10. Number 10 is a book called Studio Stories by David Simmons. Now, this is a cool little book because it specifically goes over the New York recording scene all the way back to the 50s. And it goes through a bunch of different producers, a bunch of different engineers talking about their tricks and trade. Now, the cool little tip from this book that I loved the most was a story about Phil Ramone talking about recording the band. They were talking about separation and trying to figure out, as a performance band, why it wasn't sounding great in the studio. So how to best that or how to better it. What he did was, he, instead of keeping everyone in their gobos, he pulled everyone together and used the bleed to his advantage. What he realized was that just because you're moving your piano away doesn't mean it's helping it in isolation. So the further away the piano goes with the mics, let's say you have drum set in the room, and you have your mics on your piano, most people want to shove the piano in the corner or keep it away from it and separate it. And what it's doing is it's creating phase, and all the low end from the drums are going to leak into the piano no matter what, if it's in the same room. So what he's doing and saying is move the piano as close as you can with the band. And that way use the leakage as your advantage. Because the closer everything is, the tighter the phase is going to be and the punchier it's going to be no matter what. All you're doing is just creating time constraints. Studio Stories, David Simmons, number 10. Number 9, Glen John Soundman. Now, everyone knows Glen Johns. He did everything from the Beatles to the Stones to Led Zeppelin to the Who. Even has the family bloodline that goes to Ethan, his son, his brother Andy, who've all done massively big records as well. This is basically his biography stories about what he did. And essentially, it's not terribly driven when it comes to tips and tricks. It goes more into his experiences when he was working with these bands. Why it's important in my top 10 is specifically he goes into the deepness about the bands playing together as a team and how critical that is as a performance. Now, this is all common sense to most people. Oh, duh, we want to play together. But the reason why this is important as a book is because he relates with stories from the Beatles to Rolling Stones, Led Zeppelin, the Who. All these bands work the best playing together. Now, if anyone's seen Get Back, you see Glen Johns in there pushing to make sure that they're playing together. We saw by the end of it, when they played together, the magic was there. And I think that's one of the reasons why this book is super special, is because he really goes over the fact that even in modern times, when he worked with Ryan Adams on Ashes and Fire, he still put a band in the room at sunset, and how important that was to pull out the vibe. So it's not necessarily a trick as much as it's a storybook, but the trick is pretty much to always consider thinking about putting as many people as you can together, because that's what music really is. My number 8 pick is In the Studio with Michael Jackson by Bruce Swedien. The reason why this book is cool, and it goes into some pretty good detail about working with Michael Jackson, was the fact his working relationship with Quincy Jones as an engineer/producer partnership. Now, a lot of people obviously have their go-to guys, but these two kind of stuck together on every project they ever did. They were brothers, essentially, as they called each other. And when they worked with Michael, they pretty much constantly stayed together and used the same team, which was crucial. Now, this is a technical book. It does talk about microphones. It does talk about gear. But again, it goes into more of an in-depth philosophy approach of creating the space so the music can walk into the room, or God can walk in the room, or however you want to explain it. My favorite tip from this guy that I learned years ago, and I've done on every single song since, is he talks about the bass guitar, electric specifically, and how to get, the definition of the notes without adding too much low end, too much mid, or top end, because obviously there's not a lot of stuff on the top of the electric bass. And he said he just adds around 800 hertz to the bass. And what that does is it brings out the notes. And I do believe that that is an enormous tip, because the second I started doing that, the definition of the bass started popping through. I get asked a lot about bass guitar in my mixes, and I really don't do a terrible lot to them, because usually if it's recorded well enough, it's gonna sound pretty good unless there's something wrong with the guitar itself or the player is just terrible. Using the 800 hertz trick, I feel that it is percussive enough, but not bright and harsh in a way that it's adding too much kind of snappiness. So it's fighting against drums or acoustic guitars. So 800 hertz seems to kid it in its own pocket, which is great. Number 7, Abbey Road to Ziggy Stardust by Ken Scott. The special part about this book with Ken is that it really goes into some pretty deepness with the bands that I loved growing up. The Beatles, David Bowie, Elton John. These are all bands that I actually still feel like are not real. These are magical artists that I spend years thinking about how did they create music that they did. And Ken was a part of all of those things, all the way back to when he worked at Abbey Road. And it is a technical book, and it's pretty hyper-focused when it comes down to his timeline going from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. One of the coolest tricks I learned from this book from Ken Scott is miking drum overheads with Beyer 160s. These are hypercardioid ribbon mics. They're little, they have little capsules with a tiny little ribbon in them. And the cool part about why these mics work so well is not only are they inexpensive, but they handle small rooms insanely well. If you put a large diaphragm tube mic on an overhead in a drum room and the drummer isn't great at controlling himself, you get all this wash and terrible boxiness from the room. And the thing about the 160s are they kind of round everything off in a very pleasing way. They are very hypercardioid, which means they're directionally focused on the drums and not amplifying the room. And he talks a lot about how he uses those on the overheads and why those are important. Number 6, Al Schmitt, On the Record, The Magic Behind the Music by Al Schmitt and Maureen Groening. And as everyone has said, the guy was effortless. I don't know how to explain it. I've seen him work multiple times in person, and whatever he was doing, it just worked. It was very, very, very hard to describe. Obviously, another storytelling book about his life, his journey, but very technical as well. He goes through microphones as his colors, and he chooses microphones more than he would choose EQs. So that was his philosophy, because he started very early in the days in the 50s when obviously you didn't have a ton of tracks, you didn't have a ton of options, inputs, whatnot. The band was in one room. You had to use what you had. So over those years, he just used microphones as that. He didn't really like EQs too much. The one trick I learned from him years ago, and that is in this book, is miking upright pianos from behind. That's the trick on this guy. A lot of people like to mic the piano from the front here. They open it up, they put the microphones in the front, and what that does is it adds a lot of attack. And it's cool for a specific sound, but if you really want that really nice kind of low mid sound that an upright gives you. Put it on the back side of the piano. Put a pair of mics on the back side of the piano. And he talks about it when he's worked with Henry Mancini on all the movies he did, that's what he would do, is put the mics behind the piano versus in front or underneath by the harp. Very good book, amazing story, amazing person, and the best. Number 5, Making Rumours with Ken Caillat. This guy is a little important to me because it's Ken Caillat. I've been Ken Caillat's engineer for 6 years, and he is definitely one of my favorite people and one of my closest pals that I know in the industry. And obviously, Fleetwood Mac Rumours is one of the best sounding albums, one of the best song albums of all time. And this is the story of the making of it. So it's specifically directed at that. And Ken talks about the entire process of how he got into the industry, into Wally Heider's as an engineer, going and getting picked up by the band, going to Sausalito and starting the album that became one of the biggest albums of all time. Tons of tricks, tons of good stories, just a really good read as almost entertainment. It could be a movie, absolutely. And one thing I can tell you is, going through all the multi-tracks myself for Rumours, that it was all about getting the players in the mindset to create magic. And the amount of time it took to get the stupid thing recorded was insane. It took like a year and a half. And they kept redoing certain things. There was a lot of technical issues that happened, like the tape machine eating the tapes and the way that they ended up having to hand sync the safeties tape to the original masters after the overdubs were done. I don't want to go too deeply into it because I want to save it for anyone that hasn't read it. But the cool trick that I'm going to share with you on this guide, and that I've used a lot with Ken, is vari-speed and I would actually call it half-speed recording and tracking. And specifically on this album, Lindsey Buckingham's guitars, a lot of them were vari-speed recorded. So what you would do is either you would do half-speed or vari-speed. Something you hear a lot about in the Beatles recordings, but not a lot in guitars. They usually did it on vocals or piano or something. Ken used to do it a ton, still does, because we did it a lot in Digital Land too, with acoustic guitars as kind of seasoning, just sprinkle a little pretty stuff above the already tracked guitars. Because what you would do is you would take the oscillator, the tape machine, or the crystallized clock in digital and slow it down, learn the part, tune it to that part, and then when you play it back, its pitch has been brought up to that key, and it's taken either a step up, so it's added a little top flavor above it, almost like an added 12-string, almost like a high-strung tuned guitar. But it just sounds very different. When you start adding guitars that have arpeggiated sound or just kind of round, kind of circulating, finger-picking parts, and you do that, it just puts this really kind of ethereal magic kind of sprinkle sauce over top of it. And then when you add your normal guitar over it, it just adds the glue. And that's a lot in Rumours. So that's my favorite trick from Making Rumours. Number 4, recording the Beatles. This honkin' guy, which I'm sure most people already either own or have seen. And if not, this book is absolutely the holy grail for any recording Beatles fan combination. The reason why it's not number 1 is because there's already a couple books in here that are all Beatles, and it'd just be oversaturated with Beatles. So Brian Kehoe, who wrote this book with Kevin Ryan, decided to really go in the vault of time and open up a giant can of worms when it comes to Abbey Road and all the studios the Beatles recorded with. So it goes over all the instruments, all the studio details, all the microphones, all the outboard gear, everything you can imagine is in this book. I met Brian Kehoe 2005 or something like that, right before the book came out. And he was talking to me about how this book is going to come out and how it's basically almost killed him because it took so much time out of just researching constantly. And in fact, I think it's one of the best books ever put together in history. My favorite trick in this book is talking about using the compressor for drums and bass together and how that adds the absolute glue when a band is not connected or it's not working together in unison. that if you use, let's say, a Fairchild on drums and bass together, that it's going to be compressing it together and it actually tightens the performance up. That's one of my favorite tricks from this book. This one is full of stuff. And honestly, if you haven't seen it, take a Saturday and go through it, because it's still one of these books where I actually sit down and spend an evening looking through it with my jaw straight to the floor. It's just unbelievable. Number 3, this is a twofer. So these books are pretty old actually, but I've used them and read them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. And it's definitely on the top of my list because of multiple reasons. Behind the Glass by Howard Macy. Howard Macy is probably the best recording novelist out there. I don't know anyone else that can just write engaging stuff so well and pull people in and understand the philosophy of recording. He is a godsend soul master, wonderful dude that just gets it when it comes to interviewing people, writing in theory, and just putting out kind of text and books about recording. And it goes through many different producers of the last 30 to 50 years. Everyone you can think of are in these 2 books. This is volume 1 and volume 2. This is what you got before Gearsluts, before YouTube, before anything to try to learn about what your favorite producers were doing. These are the books you can read to learn about them. In fact, there's tons of stories in these things that the guys don't even talk about in all the other videos you see of them. My favorite trick from these books is from Elliot Schneier, talking about recording acoustic guitar. Now you would think if you had any microphone in the world that you would use, obviously, a super high-end microphone. And what he found was his favorite mic for acoustic guitar is a Shure SM81. That's kind of a sleeper trick in my opinion. It's a $250 microphone and it just has a very specific sound for a small diaphragm condenser. It's kind of spitty. It kind of has this punchiness to it that a lot of those type of microphones like a 451 or any other kind of pencil microphone doesn't really have that. A KM84 doesn't have the same kind of sound as an 81. Number 2, back to the Beatles with Geoff Emerick. Here, There, and Everywhere, My Life Recording the Music of the Beatles by Geoff Emerick and Howard Macy. This guy, another storytelling book, is a masterpiece. Incredibly well written. The stories are lush and wonderful. It makes you really feel like you understand the band emotionally. There are a handful of tricks in here, but my favorite from this book is talking about him recording electric bass. And his trick that he found when he was doing this on Sgt. Pepper, and forgive me if you already know this trick, if you have the space to do it, you should try this sometime. He liked to use a figure 8 mic on the bass. And the reason why he would use that over an Omni or a cardioid is because what the Omni would do is if he was putting the microphone 7-8 feet away from the electric cabinet of the bass cabinet, it would be picking up too much room, too much ambience, and not enough definition. So he would like to put a figure 8 C12 about 7 feet in front of the electric amplifier of the bass. And what that did was get the direct sound of the amplifier, and it would get the ambience in the room in one microphone and create this really nice glued, round, very full effect. Because low end is all about the room that you place it in, 100%. Now, getting the ambience in the room amplified with the focus point of the amplifier gives you this really, really round tone. And if you listen to Sgt. Pepper, you hear it. The bass on Sgt. Pepper is almost a centerpiece of the album, just like the vocals are. It's super important. The melodic lines that Paul McCartney put into that album is insane. And by using this bass technique that he got, I believe that was one of the main reasons why that album was so successful. Was obviously the songs were great, but sonically, it was just a masterpiece as well for the time. Number 1, Chairman at the Board by Bill Schnee. Chairman at the Board, recording the soundtrack of a generation. This book is a very, very special book to me. Not only because Bill was a mentor of mine and got me into a headspace to where I'm at today, to understand all the philosophy behind making records. He goes into the stories, and that is huge for a guy that's done all sorts of styles of genres. From an engineer's perspective, this is the king of all king books to me. And a lot of it has to do with one specific thing, and he goes into massive detail about it. Critical listening. Above every kind of trick you can learn, above every compressor, what microphones you use or anything, everything starts with how you're hearing it. The one thing I can actually say about Bill Schnee and his approach to making music and audio is it's his life. It's the one thing I've never seen in any other soul, of the passion he's had and the focus he's put into it. I believe critical listening is, in theory, just understanding specific parts of audio in general. It's music making, it's audio technical, it's all those things, but in focus, it's more about listening properly and understanding why this sounds great and this sounds pretty good, but not as good as this. And the hardest part about it is if you don't have ways to compare, it's really difficult to understand how to get any kind of advancement. I'll give you a really quick example. Let's talk about reverb. So plate reverb. If you're using this wonderful analog EMT 140 plate, and it sounds wonderful, but it just makes harsh S's for some reason. It could be the age of the amplifier, it could be multiple things. Something's wrong with the box in general. If you can hyper focus down to that 2% and understand that, I believe that that's what critical listening is. So if you apply that to everything you're doing, you're mixing and tracking, you start understanding what's right and what's wrong. Over time, I think it's just like exercising, where you just get better and better and you get stronger and stronger. And you start understanding why things are good, but things are better, and why those little better things are way harder. And I always use the example of 5% is hard, but that extra 5% is in its own world 100% better. That comes with microphone listening, comes with speaker listening, comes with amplifier listening, comes with plugins, it comes with converters, it comes with reverbs. All these elements are having to listen and understand why they're good or why they're not, and what can be done to make them better. And I think the thing with Bill talks about building his studio, him and Toby Foster and Doug Sachs would go and they would just listen, hyper listen to amplifiers and electronic pieces and speakers and rooms and try to understand how to best that extra best. And I think that was the biggest thing takeaway from obviously working underneath Bill, but this book in general, and why it's my favorite recording book, is because it's a memoir. It talks about the stories he went through. I mean, he's done pretty much all my favorite records, which is why I always tuned to him when I was younger. I grew up, my first record on tape was Huey Lewis. My first CD was Whitney Houston, both done by Bill Schnee. So that's it. My top 10 list of favorite recording books in a nutshell. Thank you for watching and have a great week.